Hi Podlers, it's a new year and a new podcast. 2021 brings hope, but is off to a difficult start. Lots of us are stuck indoors and being told to stay there, prevented from leaving and connected to the rest of the world through video chats. If you'd pitched that as a format 20 years ago, you would have been told that John DeMol had beaten you to it with Big Brother. And on some days, it can feel like we're all now living in a structured reality format. So what better time than to chat to one of the UK's leading factual entertainment producers, Danny Fenton, CEO of Zig Zag Productions. Despite coming down with COVID, Danny very kindly agreed to share his experiences in getting into TV, his thoughts on what makes a good format, the challenges of lockdown, and the process of producing sports documentaries. I hope you enjoy it. Hi Danny, welcome to the pod.
Hi, Danny. Well, nice to be on the pod.
It's two Dannys. I think we were trying to work out what the plural of Dannys is, but we're not 100% certain. I know you're a big football fan, and so a question that occurred to me was, which football manager has the most similar style to you? So given that you run a company and it's a bit like being a football manager, who would you most compare yourself with, or who would someone compare you to? Are you a Klopp? Are you a Clough? Are you a Fergie? Which one are you?
Oh, it's a good question to start with. I suppose the person I'd most like to be like would be my hero, Glenn Hoddle, which would be flamboyant, great tactics. But you could say Hoddle was a nearly man, and I wouldn't want to be a nearly man. I suppose in some ways, I would compare myself to like a George Graham in sort of grinding out results, but always getting results. Maybe being feared by some and loved by others. Yeah, just off the cuff, and those I suppose were two Spurs managers who are my team. Well, of course, George Graham was always known as the man in the raincoat because we never said his name. But yeah, from instant recall, I would say somewhere between Hoddle and George Graham.
Okay, the George Graham of the TV business. Interesting. And how did you get into the TV business? I noticed that you'd spent some time at the BBC in Manchester, but how did you first get into it, and what were the early years like?
When I first tried to get into television, I didn't have any friends or family in TV, so it was sort of a step into the unknown. And my dad was a Jewish dentist who, quite a traditional occupation. And I remember when I said I wanted to work into television, his famous words to me were, "When you get a proper job, let me know."
How old were you at the time?
So I'd finished uni at 20. I studied drama and history in Liverpool. And at first I thought I wanted to be an actor, but then I realised that there were a lot of better actors than me and that it was going to be a fairly difficult career to pursue. Then I thought I wanted to be a children's TV presenter. Then I literally walked around Soho, this is 1989, knocking on doors with my CV saying, "Give us a job." In fact, I went to one place which is called Palace Film and Television, and they gave me a job as a runner. I was making teas and coffees, and I can still remember now I was earning £75 a week, and I was renting a room in Archway for £55 a week. So I had £20 a week to live off for food and travel. And it was pretty tough. And, a lot of my friends had got into reasonably well-paid jobs. And I kept asking myself, why am I doing this? And I remember they gave me a month's trial. And at the end of the month, I was determined I was going to leave. And they said, "Will you stay for another month?" And I said, yes. And then after 6 months at Palace, the world opened up in front of me. So in 1990 was really the birth of cable and satellite television. And Palace won the contract for the music channel for BSB, which was before Sky B, before the merger. BSB famous for the Squarials, and I got a job as a assistant floor manager at the Power Station, which was the music channel for BSB, and that was my first step properly into the TV industry. And funnily enough, I also auditioned as a presenter for the channel up against Chris Evans, and didn't get the presenter's job, got the assistant floor manager's job, but ended up working on Chris Evans' show, and ended up spending probably half my time in front of the camera as Chris Evans' on-camera assistant.
And then ended up in Manchester, which was a bit of a leap.
Well, like everything in my career, nothing's ever been quite straightforward. So I worked at the Power Station, and on Friday the 13th of July 1990, on that day, I collapsed in the studio during filming one of the shows. I was 22 years old, And I got taken to hospital, and I found out that I had a rare heart condition. And a week later, I had open heart surgery. And thankfully, I had corrective surgery, so it's never been a problem since. But I couldn't work for a year after that. So I enrolled to do a master's at Bournemouth University. So I did a master's in film and television, went back to study, which I thought would be kind of a good way to recuperate. Having worked in the industry, even just briefly, the pace of being a student was kind of a bit weird. It certainly gave me the experience of directing that I wanted and creative control, because actually as a runner, you have no control. You're just a gopher. Came out of Bournemouth, and Simon O'Brien, who was Damon in Brookside, but was also one of the presenters on the BSP channel, was then presenting a new football fanzine show on BBC made out of Manchester called Standing Room Only. And I went up for an interview in Manchester through his introduction, and I went in with a list of ideas, and they said, "Wow, you're full of ideas. Why don't you come and join us as a researcher?" I mean, that was a labour of love for me. The idea of sort of watching football all day and coming up with ideas for football. And I spent 2 years in Manchester in the youth and entertainment features department on Standing Room Only.
And then at some point in your career, you decided that you were going to start your own production company, which is, it's quite a big leap. Again, what was the impetus for that? What made you think, you know what, I'm going to do this all myself?
I feel like I was always entrepreneurial, and so I always aspired to have my own production company. And in fact, I originally registered the name of Zig Zag back in 1992, 93, while I was a researcher at the BBC. And I remember driving up to Manchester for the first time and stopping at a service station. And remember, at the time, you could print your own business cards at service stations. So I printed these cards saying Danny Fenton, Zig Zag Productions. And they all laughed at me when I arrived at the BBC, because I was handing out my business card as Danny Fenton Zig Zag. And I think, they thought I was a bit of a wide boy, which maybe they were right. And so I always had the aspiration to have my own company. But what I realised quite quickly is I didn't have the contacts or the relationships. And so fast forward to sort of 99, I'd been at the BBC until 96, 97. I spent a couple of years as a freelancer in the independent sector, working for the likes of Chrysalis Television and Sunset and Vine on a number of sports programmes. And I got to November 99, and I felt I'd built up enough contacts and relations to actually start my own company. And I was encouraged by other people in the industry and friends and family to go for it at that point. And I was very fortunate that my former boss from the BBC, John Whiston, who at that point was working for Yorkshire Tyne-Tees Television, said to me, "Well, what are you planning to do?" And I said, "Well, I'd like to start my own company." And he said, "Well, how do you fancy doing the high wire act, but with a safety net?" And so Yorkshire Tyne-Tees, which was part of Granada, which is now ITV, took 25% stake in Zig Zag from inception. And they were quite keen for us to be somewhere on the South Bank near the Granada offices. And we looked around, we couldn't find anywhere that we really liked. And then I remembered that there was a World War I warship on the Thames called HMS President that was owned by a charity called Interaction, who did media training for underprivileged kids. And I had volunteered to work for that charity, and they gave us our first office. So we had a cabin on a World War I warship, 3 men on a boat, literally, when we started. And within 5 years, we grew to 100 people, and we'd taken over about 3/4 of the boat.
Amazing. What a transformation. It sounds like a bit of a format in how to start a business on a boat. What makes a good format? When you're coming up with ideas, what are the key elements that you really think about to make it something that you think is really going to stand out?
I think whether it's a format or factual or even a drama, a title is always key. And in the best case scenarios, we've actually sold shows just off a title, which is quite an achievement. But I think every good format has a beginning, middle, and an end, like every great story, and it has hooks and it has very fixed beats where it takes you on an emotional journey. I think an element of surprise is always important. So always good if you can take the viewer on a journey and lead them in a certain direction and then take them in another direction at the end. But some of the best formats, I think, are the ones which have been most relatable, that are based around human instincts.
The other big area, and probably the biggest area at Zig Zag, is sports content. what are the big challenges and dynamics of creating sports content? Is it getting access? Is it the archive? Is it managing talent? What is it about sports programming that makes it an interesting but also perhaps challenging part of the business?
I think going back to my time at the BBC, sports factual and sports entertainment were always a real passion for me. I think, for us, the key thing on sports content has always been having unique access, so it's either to an individual or a team or an association, or it's having a unique archive that nobody's seen before, or a unique take on a story. And I think one thing I've also realised is that the stories that people predominantly want to hear are the ones of well-known people. So often people will pitch me, or I've tried to pitch stories which are more niche in sport, but in reality, people aren't so interested in the niche stories. They're interested in the big names, the big characters, the big access, and a new take on those people.
But you did Fashion News Football Challenge, which I suppose in a way was the ultimate in the underdog people you haven't heard of story. So, and that worked. I mean, that seemed to have been a very big success.
That was actually one of my favourite shows that we ever made, because it really was, a labour of love in terms of putting a football team together from scratch. Yes, the players were unknown, but John Fashanu himself was very high profile at the time. He'd been on Gladiators. He'd been, played for Wimbledon. He was a big character. And funnily enough, I remember just after I'd signed him up, because he was key to us getting the commission, the head of Bravo, the channel that we sold it to, was very keen for me to get him on board. And then the week that we signed him up, he was on the front page of the News of the World in a fake sting with the fake shake. And I thought that was going to be sort of the end of the show. But in actual fact, the broadcasters were delighted, because it brought a lot much more publicity to Fashanu and the show. And then, we put a team together from scratch. I was actually one of the judges on screen, the Simon Cowell of football, which I quite enjoyed. And it was a blast. The team went for a whole season in a league. We made 3 shows a week for 9 months. And the whole thing snowballed. And remember, this is a time before social media, but we had thousands of fans turning up at Hendon Stadium, where we were based.
I went once.
Oh, you were there, and we end up selling the perimeter advertising and shirt sponsorship, and people wanted to buy merchandising. And it's a show that I'd love to make again, given the knowledge I have now of what we did then.
And also, you've had extensive experience and success in producing for US networks, which I guess can't be so straightforward as a British indie. And I'm sure a lot of British indies would love to have penetrated that market and to form those links. So how did you create those links? And again, what are the challenges of being a British indie producing for a US network? It can't be so straightforward.
Right from the get-go, as they say in America, we targeted America. So I can remember in our first year of Zig Zag, we got 5 paid developments from TLC, and 3 of those shows got picked up, which was just like a phenomenal strike rate. And probably in our first 5 years, 30% of all our content was for the US market. And that's grown over the years. We're now, we're in our 21st year, and 50% of everything we do is for the US. And I think that's partly to do with our sensibility, that we understand sort of the US market. It's partly because the US love UK producers, and obviously we never want to convince them otherwise. So UK producers, not just Zig Zag, do very well in the US, but I think you have to adapt to their way of thinking. You have to be able to make programs in a certainly different style to British program making. But I've always said, in the UK, we might have 1,000 channels on our EPG, but we only have probably 10 buyers. And in America, just in unscripted, which is the main area we're in, there are 71 buyers of unscripted content. And that's not even including all the streamers that now exist. So if you've got a good idea and you're willing to get on a plane when you're allowed to get on a plane, America is very lucrative. When flying is allowed, or when flying was allowed, I would often spend 50 days a year in the US on, traveling between West Coast and East Coast.
And so that physical presence actually makes a very big difference.
I think so. I mean, first time I went there, we had a US agent, which we still have. And it's important, I think, to have a US agent. And they rolled out the red carpet for us, and everybody loved our ideas. And metaphorically, I felt like all the agents were waiting at the airport as I left, waving goodbye and rolling out the red carpet. And I never heard from them again. So what I realize is if you want to sell stuff in America, you need to be in front of people.
And then that speaks to some of the challenges, therefore, and you touched on it on the travel side of being a producer over the last 9 months in a world of COVID. What have you found to be the big challenges in terms of what you're producing, but also things like accessing executives and talent and everything? I mean, it's such a profound change to everything that we've done, and it must have such a big impact on you guys.
I defy anybody to say they haven't found the last 9 to 10 months very challenging. And we had 5 shows that were put on hold when the pandemic hit. Thankfully, 3 of those shows were able to be made and are now airing in various countries. I suppose one thing about the pandemic in terms of accessing TV executives is in some ways it's made it more of a meritocracy. So you can actually get in front of commissioners in some ways easier because they're all sitting at home like most producers are, and they've got more bandwidth to actually interact with people. And I suppose in the US, they don't care whether you're in London or New York or LA because everyone's getting the same treatment. So getting in front of people, I'd say, has not been more difficult. It's probably been more easy. But I suppose getting shows commissioned has been maybe slightly more difficult because people haven't known where they are with their budgets and things have been in flux a lot more. But compared to other industries, television has been fluid and shows are being sold, shows are being made, shows are being aired, and I don't see that changing.
Have you had to change budgets? Have you had to add in COVID premiums to budgets, for example?
100%. I mean, I think, there is a cost effect of COVID. We've been fortunate, in the UK that the government, one good thing the government have done is they brought in Project Restart, which was the insurance cover, because one of the things that was stopping productions happening was the insurance companies weren't prepared to cover for COVID. But because the government underwrote the insurance companies, that has allowed production to go back into full swing. I have noticed that budgets have become tighter, and I have noticed costs have gone up. But in most cases, the broadcasters, at the very least, are offering to match fund those additional COVID costs.
And what about logistics on the productions that you have been able to move forward with? Is there a lot of distancing? Have you added in staff who are dedicated to COVID protection? Have you had all of those elements as well?
I think each production has its own challenges. One of the shows we made during lockdown, 1.0, the movie, was shot in a bubble, and we managed to get everybody tested, including the crew and the contestants, and shot it all. Thankfully, there were no cases of COVID, and that works because it was a contained environment. And I think for reality shows, that works well because you're in one location. I think for documentaries, we're dealing with smaller crews, similar protocol are required. But I think TV, next to professional sport, has probably been the best prepared or best served in terms of protocol practice.
So I was looking through some of the accolades that Zig Zag has had over the years, whether winning a Rose d'Or for a best format, consistently ranked in Real Screen's top 100 indie production companies, accolade after accolade, which is an amazing testament to your success and the rest of the team. But you are an indie in a world where there has been enormous amounts of consolidation, and the bigger companies have brought lots of other smaller indies into their folds. Has there ever been a time when you've thought to yourself, you know what, I'm happy to be part of somebody else's gang and the rewards that flow from that? There must have been opportunities and approaches over the years, and interested to know how you've ended up staying as an indie 21 years in.
We actually haven't always been independent. So as I mentioned, when we began, we were 25% owned by Granada via Yorkshire Tyne Teas. And we had the option after 2 years to buy ourselves out. And at that time, we took the option because the company sort of started really well in its first few years. And we didn't feel we needed the safety net any longer. And we remained independent until 2010. And we got approached by a small French company you might have heard of called Banijay. And
oh yes, they've got quite big recently.
And we decided at the time that it was a good idea to sell. I'm not sure in hindsight we married for the right reasons. Let's say maybe we married more for money than love. And 6 weeks before the wedding, we got slightly nervous about getting married. On the honeymoon, we found out they were cheating on us. When they bought us to be the US and UK arm of the empire, which, believe it or not, at that time they didn't have either UK or US, even though they had bought 10 companies in 10 months in 10 countries. And we were to be the Western Front. And as I say, on the honeymoon, we found out that they were buying a US company, which also meant that we had to close down in the US, and we filed for divorce. And 6 months later, we got divorced. And for the last 10 years since then, we've remained independent again. And so the lesson of that, in answer to your question is, would we ever consider selling again? Yes, of course we would. Anybody would if the deal was right. But I think the lesson we learned is you have to marry for the right reasons and choose your bedfellows carefully, because in most cases you have to be tied in for quite a long time. And I don't regret buying ourselves back, because being in control of your own destiny and the value of independence is not something to be underestimated.
In terms of formats that you've seen over the course of your long and storied career, if there was one that you could point to and you would say, you know what, I wish that was mine, I wish that I'd come up with that, which one would it be?
The crass answer would be Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, because off one show, a company was built and sold, and it's a format that still sustains today. I think in many ways, the ideal format is a factual entertainment format, is The Apprentice. And it's a format that I was sort of jealous of at its inception. And for many years, I thought it was the ideal format, a combination of entertainment and factual, which is something that we'd always aspired to achieve. In latter years, I found it to become a bit repetitive and a bit predictable. But as an example of a successful format, and like, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, it has sustained, for many years in many territories. So I suppose those two between them are ideal examples of game and fact entertainment.
Yeah, and there's been an innovation as well, I think, in The Apprentice, with things like moving from it being a job to an investment, for example, in the UK. That was a smart move.
Yeah, absolutely.
So there has been some innovation, I think, in that one. And of course, it has spawned a platform for political success, which nobody could have predicted. So let's.
I'm assuming you don't mean Lord Sugar. You mean Donald Trump?
Not yet, but let's not rule him out.
No.
So at this point, I asked my guests for them to share their lockdown movie, album, book, and box set that would get them through a lockdown and even a positive test for COVID, should they ever get one.
Yes.
So, which may mean that they need to isolate longer than they thought.
Absolutely.
Which ones would you choose in each of those categories?
I'd say my tastes are quite eclectic, and I think my movie choice probably would have been something like Goodfellas, but I noticed, on one of your other podcasts, your previous guest chose that. And I'd say, to go more eclectic, I always loved the movie Europa, and I don't know if you ever saw it, but it was Agnieszka Holland's first ever film. And the reason I loved it, it's a World War II film, which is a period of time that I'm fascinated in, but it had no famous stars in it, and it treated that really dark period with a wry sense of humor. And it's funny, it came out in 1990, which is the same year as Goodfellas, but both those films sort of stick very strongly in my mind.
What about an album, as they used to be known?
Yeah, I thought long and hard about the album. I mean, most of my friends or family will tell you that I'm a fanatic for the band James, the Manchester band from the 80s and 90s,
sure,
who I've probably seen in concert more than any other band. So the easiest answer would be, say, the best of James, because it would have all my favourite tracks on it, or probably the best of the 80s, because I listen to a lot of 80s music. But if there's one album that really sticks out for me as being the most memorable album, it's from a band called XTC, and they did an album called English Settlement in the 80s. And I think that was, for me, the strongest and best album of any band I've ever heard.
What about a book?
Surprisingly, I'm not as well read as I should be. And I do read a lot of sports books, which might not surprise you.
That's great.
And and again, it's from the 90s. I possibly stuck somewhere between the 80s and the 90s, was a book called Football Against the Enemy by Simon Cooper, which
Got it.
at the time won, the book of the year. And the reason I loved it is I love, particularly football, I love books that go beyond the game, but look at the sort of the power of the game. And that was really about the power of fandom in many different countries around the world. And that book had a massive impact on me, and probably on my attitude towards sports. So when you ask me about sports documentaries, I suppose the thing that I didn't really elaborate on is anything that we make, I would say, is always by the fans, for the fans. We always take a sort of fans perspective on programming.
And box set.
I mean, box set is such a hard one because there's so many great box sets.
And how many from the 80s and 90s?
Not many from the 80s and 90s.
A bit limited.
No. So I would say probably one set in the 80s and 90s. I love Fauda, the Israeli drama, and that would be right up there. Probably up alongside that, I would put Gomorrah, the Italian mafia drama. I suppose things that have gangs and violence for some reason appeal to me. But those two spring to mind as my sort of top recommendations.
Well, Danny, thank you so much for coming onto the podcast, and we'll look out for more retrospectives from the 80s and 90s over the course of the next few weeks and months.
Thanks, Danny.